Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's jointly hosted webinar by myself, Samantha Manning of Searches UK. And today we're kindly joined by Harriet Holmes of Thirdfort. Please, can I double check that everyone can hear me? If you can, please do let me know in the chat and the questions tab. Also, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and a copy will be sent out after the session has ended. Also, if you have got any questions or you would like any further information, please again use the chat and the questions tab and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions at the end of today's session. But for now, let me hand over to Harriet and thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you for that introduction. That's really nice. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you all this morning. So today we are going to be talking, and you can see for no surprise there on the slides, nice and big for you all to read, about detecting and preventing money laundering and the role that property professionals have the opportunity to play within that process. So we'll be exploring a little bit more around how property crime has evolved, the part that property professionals play in recognising and preventing fraud, and the process that property firms need to implement to protect themselves and to protect their clients. Now, what I find interesting is that property fraud has become an increasing problem in the UK, and it's got devastating consequences for individuals and the economy as a whole. The fraudulent activity that we're often talking around and we're reading around is that it can range from people falsifying mortgage applications to complex organised schemes that involve multiple properties and fake identities. The impact of property fraud, we have to acknowledge, is not just financial loss to victims. It can result in emotional, psychological damage to that individual, and it can destabilize the property market as well. And what it leads to is ultimately a distrust in the system that we are working so hard to maintain. Now, you can see there I've put quite a bold statement. Fraud is now the most common crime in England and Wales. And that's because fraud appears to be the crime of choice, okay, for the criminals. It accounts for 40% of all crime currently. And it's pretty phenomenal, isn't it? When you hear that figure read out aloud, 40%. For me, I find some of these statistics I'm going to share with you today a little bit mind-blowing. And here's another one that's been thrown around recently. It has been reported that the annual cost to the UK of economic crime is between 290 billion to 350 billion. Okay, annually, that's the cost of economic crime to the UK. And for me, again, it is just mind-blowing. That is a huge sum of money. How my mind struggles to even contextualize that. Okay, I struggle to think, like, how much is that in real life, in reality? And to give that a little bit of context and to enable us all to kind of try and visualize this amount of money, if I said to you that this is roughly twice what we spend on our NHS yearly, it's around 27 times what we spend on foreign aid, 3 times what we spend on education, roughly, and 20 times what we've committed to policing yearly. Just roughly they are. It just gives you an idea of the phenomenal nature and the context of that amount of money. 290 billion to 350 billion is the cost of economic crime to the UK. It is just staggering. Over the past 2 years, 64% of businesses have experienced fraud, corruption, or other financial crime, a figure that's also increased by 50% over the past four years. So, as I say, some of these statistics are utterly mind-blowing. So, what is fraud? We often talk about fraud, but in simple terms, what are we talking about here? Now, simply put, that fraud is when somebody does something that gains a dishonest advantage. It's often financial, and it's financial over another person. Many words are used to describe fraud, and I'm sure if I was to ask you all what words you would use, you would have a huge list of words that you would use to describe fraud. We've got things like scam, con, swindle, extortion, sham, double cross, hoax, cheat, ploy. They're just a few of the words that I hear when we're talking about fraud. And I'm sure you've got a lot of others that you could throw into the mix as well. It's important to remember and acknowledge that fraud can be committed against individuals and businesses alike. As I already mentioned, property fraud is a serious ongoing issue here in the UK. Millions are lost yearly through various scams, and they vary from things like fraudulent land registry changes to maybe underhand landlord practices. One of the most harmful, though, methods that a fraudster will use is to go after your home. And this is no more harmful than, like, when we think about harm, if you think about somebody taking your home from underneath you and what your home means to you, you can understand why it is one of the most harmful. What they do is, and what they can do is that baddies, criminals will request changes to the land registry to either transfer assets into their ownership, or they'll impersonate the current owner, and that's for financial gain, okay, through the property. That's what they're looking to do. They're looking to gain through your property, my property, or maybe your neighbour's or your family's property. There are some examples when the risk of property fraud is potentially higher than in other situations. And when we're dealing with these kind of examples, what we can do as professionals is approach those with more of an inquisitive mind. We can take these into consideration when we're applying our risk-based approaches and when we're deciding what level of due diligence we would be comfortable with in order to proceed. Now you can see up there on the screen, we've got some bullet points. So the first one there is any instances where a property is vacant, it's empty. Maybe that could be for so many reasons, but maybe it's a rental. It could be a long-term rental. It could be a short-term rental. It might even be a holiday let. Okay, we've got a lot more holiday lets in the UK than maybe we've ever had before. Now, why are these a risk? Well, these properties are seen as an easier target. The owner isn't present, and it can even lead to instances where the baddies can get access to the properties. Maybe that gives them an opportunity to, say, intercept the mail and make it easier for them to impersonate the true owner. The second one up here is distance between the property and the owner, and I'm going to share with you some real life examples that demonstrate this today. But this is a good one because, again, any distance created between the owner and the property makes it harder to manage and to know what's going on in your property. You're always reliant on somebody else sharing information with you if you are not there. Again, this can be seen when we've got people working away from home. This could be when maybe somebody's gone into long-term care, maybe somebody's gone into hospital. Those situations, again, can lead to family being preoccupied, family maybe not being present in the way that they would have been before. In reality, that they've got other things on their mind. And so that gives criminals the opportunity to prey on the vulnerable who are in a position where maybe they wouldn't spot things about their own properties that they would if they were there and present. For the same reasons, like I say, as vacant properties as well. And then baddies aren't, I think one thing we have to acknowledge is that baddies don't have the same conscience, as me and you. Baddies, they just don't have that mindset. They see these situations as victimless. They see it as there's just a financial loss and it's likely that the victim will get reimbursed in some way. They don't take into consideration the emotional or the psychological toll that that might take on a victim or even the victim's family. And so that's important as well for us to recognise when we're considering these high risk situations here. Other examples here, we've got like high value properties. If the location's particularly sought after, it kind of goes without saying that there's likely to be more value in that property. It means that the baddies have got a bigger opportunity maybe to get more benefit out of the property. It might also mean that it's easier for them to move the property on, to sell it. It might give them a really nice excuse for the need for speed or for rushing the matter through. Obviously, there's less time that it's under observation, under scrutiny by a professional. What they're hoping there is there's less opportunity for us to spot the red flags and the warnings that may be present. Mortgage-free properties is another really great example. Why is that the case? Why is it that unencumbered properties are attractive to the baddies? Well, in some instances, that could mean that it's easier for them to make the transfer, to fraudulently transfer the title deeds. A property owned outright, it means there's no lender checks involved in the same way that there would be a mortgage. Essentially, we're just talking about fewer professionals, fewer processes involved, fewer touch points between the baddie and the professionals. And what they see that as is there's less chance again of them getting caught. Now, real life examples, we all love a real life example to just really bring it to life. And there's kind of no better example than this case here, Reverend Michael, a case of property fraud. As we already touched on this morning, it could occur when a buyer unknowingly purchases a house from a fraudulent seller. And this can happen when someone owns a property but they don't reside in it, giving the fraudulent seller the opportunity to assume the identity of the homeowner and receive the payment. And this is what happened exactly in this case. Reverend Michael had been working away. Actually, he was working in North Wales at the time. He was alerted by a neighbour, fortunately for him, who told him that someone was in his home, the lights were on. And the neighbour spotted that because it's unusual, because they knew that this gentleman wasn't at home. When he arrived at the property, so he drove from North Wales back to where he lived, he arrived at the property and he could see builders in the property. And obviously he knew he'd not instructed any builders. He saw that they were conducting like work inside the home, and he went to the front door. He tried his key to get in, but the key didn't work. He did ultimately gain entry via a builder who did let him in, but the house was gutted, okay, like top to bottom gutted. They'd ripped everything out, floors, like units, everything. It was literally like a shell. His home had essentially gone. It wasn't recognisable at all. Okay, the new owner had decided to do a complete top to toe renovation. Mr. Hall called the police in this case, but the police declared it to be a civil matter, not a criminal. And Mr. Hall accessed in that moment, obviously the land registry now is online, he accessed the land registry to review whose name appeared on the deeds. And when he did that, he noticed that, in fact, as of August the 4th, a new man's name appeared and not his own. I mean, can you imagine that feeling in that moment? You just can't, can you? You just can't envisage how that would feel. The house was sold to a new owner for 131,000 by someone impersonating Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall had bought the property in the 1990s, okay, so quite some time ago. This situation is one, like I say, you just can't imagine. An investigation was actually done by the BBC Radio 4, the You and Yours programme. And what they did in that investigation is they obtained a copy of the driving licence that was used to impersonate Mr. Hall, details of a bank account that was set up in his name, that was set up purposely for receiving the proceeds of the sale. And they received a phone clip, a recording of a man that claimed to be Mr. Hall instructing the solicitors to sell the house. The new owner actually remains the owner today. They now legally own that property. Mr. Hall was working with obtaining compensation for the loss of the property, but he's been unable to regain formal ownership of his house, a house that he's owned since coming out of university. We have to acknowledge, though, that while Mr. Hall did lose his home, the buyer was also innocent. Like, the buyer wasn't involved in the fraud. The buyer bought the home in good faith. He had no idea that the seller was nothing more than a fraud. The buyer didn't know. They were completely innocent. So as well as Mr. Mike Hall being a victim, in some ways, the buyer was also a victim. And we have to, again, remember that. There's another example of a gentleman called Angus. And Angus' his property was sold for, without his knowledge, I should say, for 180,000. He had secured work similar to Mr. Hall in Cornwall, but he took the decision, rather than leaving the house empty, to rent it out. And he rented it out via a local estate agent. A criminal who named themselves Stephen Jones took up the tenancy. He paid the rent, he paid the council tax, but he never moved into that property. And odd that might seem to me and you, that he paid the rent and he paid the council tax, but what he did that for a purpose, and he did that to gain entry to that property. Okay, he did it so that he had access to the property in order to sell the house, and he sold it for 196,000, which actually was an undervalue. Okay, it was below market value. And I'll share that case because that comes really important later on when we're talking about red flags. We're always looking out as professionals for anything that may alert us to warnings and red flags and opportunities to spot situations like this. And undervalue is one of those. Now, these two cases do leave me with a lot of questions, and I'm sure they do you when you think about them and when we read about them in the media. It's great for us to take time, take stock, and absorb these examples, and we should absorb them with an inquisitive mind. And my mind runs directly, and it runs off in lots of directions when I read these kind of cases. And I'm thinking, did they verify the ID? What proof of address documents did they get? Did they verify the identity? Did they conduct proof of ownership checks? What did the land registry tell them? Is the date of birth and the age that the property was purchased, is there alignment there? Did the fraudulent seller appear to know the property when we talked? And did they share anything about the property that was unique, or could they answer the questions that, as a conveyancer, I was asking of them? Did they express a need for speed or to accelerate the matter through? How was their communication? Were they calm and collected, or did they often seem agitated at additional questions? And did I always communicate via email, or was there opportunity for phone or video calls, or did I meet them in person? The list of questions that you might have is actually endless, and I'm sure we could, between us, carry on and make a really long list. These are just a few that spring straight to mind for me when I read these examples. Now, what happens next in these situations? Is there any recourse for the victim? It's likely that in reality the criminal's long gone. And even if the criminal themselves was found, it's likely that the money is long gone. It's likely that the money has been led. It may not even still be in the UK. It's quite common that we see in these situations the criminals moving the money overseas so that it can't be found, and ultimately making it harder for the authorities to bring it back to the UK. Now, the Land Registry Act places a legal liability on the HM Land Registry to indemnify against losses resulting from errors or omissions on the title register. This includes errors resulting from fraud that's perpetrated by third parties, as we've just seen in those two examples. Now, this webinar actually, and I didn't know this in advance of time, but it couldn't have kind of been more well timed. In fact, the Land Registry last week on the 18th of July released its annual report. And like I say, just perfect timing for today's webinar. If you go right to the end of the Land Registry's annual report, you'll find a document named Appendix D. And in that Appendix D, you will find more information on the indemnity fund. And what that does is Appendix D breaks it down. Okay, breaks it down into what things have been claimed for, how much, and more granular detail. And this confirms, the current one confirms that fraud and forgery accounted for nearly 76% of the total claims that were submitted to the fund in 2022 to 2023. 76% of claims to the fund, okay, that the Land Registry has to have for fraud and forgery. It's a significant increase on the previous year, which was recorded at 37%. Okay, so significant increase. We've gone from 37 to 76. Okay, so I think again that's important for us to acknowledge that increase. It's important for us to see the trajectory going up. Again, we can see that if we look at the figures there that are broken down for us, payment values this year are actually down from last year, but the amount of claims paid out is up. This year, 2022 to 2023, the Land Registry paid 3.5 million out of the fund for 627 claims. Whereas in 2021 to 2022, the Land Registry did pay 7 million, just short of actually, for 598 claims. And then you can compare that to, they've got all the previous data in there. It was 5.5 million the year before for 540 claims in the period of 2020 to 2021. So we can see a significant increase in the amount of claims for fraud and forgery, which I think is important, like I say, for us to recognise this morning. Now, just to kind of spice up this morning, it is important to acknowledge that it's not just those who own properties who are at risk, or those buying properties. Actually, there is a significant risk in the rental market as well. Fraudsters are always quick to take advantage of any opportunity that they can to extort for gain, basically. We're in the middle of what can be described as a housing crisis, accompanied by higher purchase prices, mixed in with a bit of a cost of a living crisis and COVID as well. We're still talking about COVID, even in July 23. Many people have been left with no option but to rent. And Action Fraud received more than 6,000 reports of online rental scams up until December 2022. And the reported losses of the victims was more than 10 million. Again, the numbers are mind-blowing. Rental frauds often target vulnerable people. An example of this could be students looking for university accommodation. We have seen quite a rise in the reports of those situations. Now, rental fraud happens when would-be tenants are tricked into paying upfront fees for rent for a property. It is a type of kind of like advanced fee fraud in some ways. The scam works by offering to let the property. Often it's in prime areas again. Below market rent is again showing up. They ask for deposits in advance. Sometimes they don't even let people view the properties. They ask for full payment up front to secure it. They use pressure tactics to make people feel like they're going to miss out or lose the opportunity. Or similarly, they have situations where they convince prospective tenants to part with personal information, credit card details, checks, cash. Like I say, sometimes they don't even let them see a property that potentially isn't actually up for rent anyway. Any payments that are sent usually kind of vanish in the same way as we just talked about with the property fraud situation. They're not returned, and the fraudulent landlord is a scam. And there is a real life example that I do want to share just to kind of bring that to kind of real life for everybody listening. There was a student, and there was quite a big problem with this in Scotland, all around students looking for accommodation. And the reason that it was a problem was obviously there wasn't enough accommodation to go round for all the students. And so students were looking at all methods to secure accommodation. There was a student called Hamish, and he spotted the property on Facebook Marketplace. The advert said that rent and bills would be £950 monthly. Hamish and his friend Eric were invited to a 9 p.m. viewing at a flat. It was attractive. It was an attractive place in the city. It was quite a popular area. They were really keen to go and have a look. And the average price of properties in that area was actually around £1,000 for like. The flat's apparent landlord called himself William Wilson. After seeing the flat, Hamish and his friend paid £2,300 to Wilson by a bank transfer to secure the rental property. But after they'd sent that money, the landlord just stopped replying to their emails, and actually they were ghosted by the landlord. It transpires that the flat that they used in this example was owned by a private company, and the private company provided tourist accommodation. Okay, so holiday let accommodation. Photos of the property were online. They were used in online advertising for the holiday let company. And it was these photos that the fraudster took to create the listings on Facebook Marketplace. He basically harvested the photos for his own purpose. To make this fraud more convincing and appear more legitimate, what he did was send a pack, basically, upfront to renters, including like corporate paperwork, bank statements. He actually even sent a fake passport in the name of William Wilson. But on closer inspection of those documents, what transpired was that although they gave a veneer of respectability and a veneer of legitimacy to this crime, the ownership payment papers that he provided for the company and the bank statements, they didn't match, they didn't align. So when you looked at the detail within them and you verified them, they didn't match what they should have matched. The landlord number that he gave was actually linked to a different business. The passport was suspect in that the unique number that should be present when we get copies and we review passports wasn't visible. It had been cut off. And it looked like the signature was potentially like an electronic signature that had been placed on the passport. Now, this case demonstrates the importance of verification, and be careful when you're looking at the evidence that's given to you. Never accept anything blindly. Always take time to consider the detail. Never just receive something and save it to your file without full consideration of what it is you've been given. And I always say to people, always be curious. Approach everything that you're given with a curious mind. Now, these examples demonstrate some common red flags. So when we're thinking about all three examples that we've talked about this morning, there are some common things that we can all be alive to in our day-to-day activities. So what we're thinking about here is free listings. Fraudsters will use free listing pages, so whether that's for selling a property, buying a property, rental, that's websites and not limited to, might I add, Gumtree, Facebook Marketplace, and many others. In contrast, what reputable landlords tend to do is they use agencies, they'll use websites like Rightmove or Zoopla, and reputable portals in order to get their properties out to market. Multiple advertisements of the same property. What we need to then look for, if we're doing a bit of a Google check on the property on our clients, we're looking for multiple things that come up that are linked to the same property or the same name. What we do is look for slight differences, discrepancies, differences in the pictures maybe. Poorly worded advertisements. So if you receive an advert and there's lots of spelling errors, it doesn't quite flow, it doesn't really make sense, keep an eye out for anything like spelling, grammar, flow. I often read things and think that doesn't quite make sense to me. That doesn't look how I would imagine it to look in the layout, or the text sizing or the text font. They can be things that we can be alive to. Do people have an online, is there an online presence? Would you expect there to be an online presence? does that align to what you would expect for the person that you're engaging with? If there's a company involved, is there an online presence for the company? Is there any adverse information on an individual, for example? We talked already today about low prices. My dad always taught me, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And that's a real life, a life thing that we can all live by. Often, if something does sound too good to be true, if it is a lower price than the others, question why. Why is it lower? Why are they selling it at an undervalue? Is that plausible? Do I understand the reason and the rationale behind that? Does it make sense to me that this is being done in the way it's being done? Any request for bank details, I think for me that can be a warning, that can be a red flag. Combined, especially when there's pressure tactics, if somebody shares with you that there is pressure involved. Photographs, so if there's photographs or a lack of photographs even, think about the consistency, think about the alignment, the quality, the appearance, and just really like the genuineness. Like, is it genuine? The simple steps that we can all take, and I often used to do this when I worked in conveyancing, was using Google Maps, Google Earth, having a look at an address. And this wasn't just restricted to conveyancing matters either, but if I was looking at something, I would have a look and see, is there a business of that nature at that address? Or is that house, does it look like what I would expect it to look like? Does it align? Does it fit with what the client is telling me? You can look at it from street level. I've been known to trying to figure out which property it is by looking for like the bins with the numbers on where people don't have house numbers on their phones. I have been in that situation before. Fraudsters will try and steal genuine photos and use them. So we can leverage technology here if we need to. On a risk-based approach, what you might find you do is if you have concerns, you can use reverse image search to check whether that image is being used elsewhere and where else it is being used. Anybody who says to you that viewings weren't an option, or anybody who comes to you and their knowledge of the property is limited, and it's limited more than what you would expect it to be. Communication, I touched on this already today, but how do they communicate? If it's via email, consider the makeup of the email address. Does that alert you to anything? Have they used a generic email address? Often we see a lot of property fraud. So fraudsters can keep tabs on what they're doing. They'll use the property address as the email address. So it won't be like a personal one like maybe me or you might have, with like your name or a common number that you use for your email address. It'll actually be the property address, and they do that so that they can keep tabs. This might not be their only fraud that they've got going. They'll be spinning multiple disks, and that could be a key indicator, a key warning that maybe you want to pay a little bit more attention and do some more due diligence. Consider things like a person's tone, aggression, pressure, bribes, threats. Criminals will go to any lengths to try and get their matter through and to be successful in committing their crimes. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got people who are over friendly, or maybe they share lots of information and they're trying to paint this picture, this nice friendly picture, this nature. Maybe they're trying to paint you this fairy tale kind of idea. So just be careful. And it is hard because in conveyancing, I think the tricky thing for you guys is actually a lot of people want it done fast. A lot of people want speed. Your first time buyer wants to tell you everything. And so it's just making sure that we're conscious of these in the background. These are not necessarily things that would make our client higher risk in isolation. But if you've got a couple, even if you've only got one, what you might want to do is just pay a little bit more attention, a little bit more time to carefully consider and document. Now, it's really important that you document your consideration of these red flags. You document your thought process, your rationale, the considerations you made at the time you made them. Okay, that's really important. Make sure all this stuff is captured within your risk assessment so that if the regulator were to come in, you could say, this is why I did what I did at the time I did it. And that, I can't stress to you how important it is getting all these observations down on paper. Another kind of top tip there, I would say is, if you are in a conveyancing team, every now and again, once a month at your regular team meetings, talk about red flags together. Bring these kind of examples that I've shared today to your team, read through them and discuss how would you have done it. Make sure that red flags are centre of mind, keep it topical, keep it relevant, review the media, bring these examples to team meetings, just analyse them together, talk about what steps you might have taken, what questions might have you asked, what might have concerned you about the situations, and how could you have maybe prevented the situations occurring. This can really help us with the education point. This can really help us in doing the right thing. And there's no better way to learn sometimes than learning from other people's experiences and maybe mistakes that happened in the examples that are often shared in the media. Now, how can we conduct our client due diligence? How can we use technology and leverage technology to help us? Now, firstly, I would say we can adhere to some kind of good core basic principles of fraud and money laundering that can help us really mitigate the risk. So good governance would be the first one. Having good quality, detailed policies, controls and procedures in place. And education, so I just touched on education before, but education of employees and keeping it relevant and topical education as well. As part of those controls, we can consider what technology we can implement that will help us fight to ultimately protect you, the firm, your community, society from getting embroiled in something like fraud and money laundering. And some critical checks that can help you mitigate the risk. Now, there are many layers to a client due diligence process that put you in a position of truly knowing your client. The first one would be address verification that we can talk about today. This uses basic information about a client, and what it does then is it uses external sources to verify that address. It will use things like electoral roll, bank accounts, credit, mortgages for validation. So it checks that your client lives at that address, and using technology, we can verify the address against sources that you might not have access to. If we're screening in a manual way, we're screening quite often quite insular. The verification of that information is often not vast, okay? We might get one document to verify their address, whereas by using technology, what we do is we open doors to multiple verification points. Screening, including PEPs and sanctions. This can extend further as well to include warnings, fitness and propriety, alerting you to somebody's reputation, character, and PEPs and sanctions, obviously, importantly, in regards to enhanced due diligence requirements as well. Document verification. So this is critical that we seek out to confirm, and the examples today show how important this is. The authenticity of the relevant documentation that you rely upon for client due diligence. Manual review is vulnerable to human error, and it's costly and it's time consuming to review. You need to have confidence in your client's identity, and technology can support you in identifying forgeries. It can offer NFC chip readings to verify that the document is genuinely a government issued ID. Confirming that the document's not being reported lost or stolen. Now, without technology, doing those checks manually is not always possible, and we can't expect everybody in our team to be document specialists. Often, our teams are not given specific training on what would look like a fraudulent ID and how to spot it, and so they might only be able to spot the most obvious ones. And as we develop as a society and as technology develops, unfortunately, what that means is criminals have got access easier to what I would call good quality fraudulent documents, which are harder for a naked eye to spot. So technology can really feed into mitigation here. Then we need to kind of think about the ID and the person in front of you and the person that's instructing you. What technology can then do is kind of go one step further and prove the linkage between the person in front of you, the person within the ID documents and instructing you, and that verification and drawing the circle, the full 360 circle, using face matching and running a liveness test, ensuring that the person is present in real time and matches the actual photo evidence that they've provided. And then we've got source of funds and source of wealth checks as well. Now, open banking technology means that you can verify an individual's true income. Open banking is a phenomenal development and a really great tool that we can all leverage. It enables checks on somebody's source of funds to be done in a secure manner. It allows for a secure data exchange between a client's bank account and a technology provider. It enables independent verification of salary and financial information. It provides data integrity via a system that cannot be fraudulently manipulated by a criminal or a baddie. It also speeds up the process. Have you ever been in that position where you're waiting for like a PDF to come through and the client's saying to you, oh, I can't get these downloaded from my bank? This is done in minutes. It's a really efficient manner. It's done by a mobile phone device. It reduces that risk attached to like pay slips that can be falsified. Yeah, open banking technology is a real game changer when it comes to source of funds. Now, other steps that you can take to protect your firm beyond what we just talked about is things like audit and review. So checking people are doing the right thing, are they adhering to the policies and controls and procedures that you've put in place? Avoiding patterns, so make sure you're not doing everything on a Friday afternoon. You guys will have all heard of the Friday afternoon situations that occur quite often in conveyancing firms traditionally. Don't rely on anyone else in the transaction unless you're absolutely confident 100% in their controls and procedures. You know your own controls and procedures, and you don't know anybody else's. So unless you can be 100% absolute confident, don't rely on anyone else. Be confident in your own policies, controls, and procedures. Consider what is ordinary for you, your clients, your service, your types of communications with clients, and make sure that's communicated with your team so that they know what's ordinary. By knowing what's ordinary, that will let them know what is not ordinary, what falls outside of your ordinary for your firm, because that will look differently for each firm that's listening on this call. Provide training beyond the foundations and consider specifics like your chosen technology. Do your staff know how to identify a genuine ID document? What about alternative methods of verification? Are your staff aware of specific red flags that they need to be looking out for that are relevant to the department that they work in? Look out for specific risks and consider what mitigation steps you can implement as a result. Now, this should form part of your practice-wide risk assessment. And in that, you should be thinking around jurisdictions, locations, property size and the nature, any complex structures. What about source of funds? Where is the money coming from? The size and nature of the transactions, the services that you're offering to clients, and maybe the delivery channels. What I would say, and I always say in these sessions, is use your internal antenna. Always be curious and approach everything with curiosity. And just remember, money laundering is not a victimless crime. Nothing could be further than the truth of this misconception that money laundering and fraud are victimless. They're not victimless at all. The true cost is borne by the victims of the crimes which generate dirty money and that perpetrate fraud as well. And that can be things like drug trafficking, it can be fraud, it can be modern slavery, cybercrime and corruption, among many others. And all these crimes leave a wake of suffering. And that's what we're all fighting to stop. That's what together we can really make a difference. It's not just about the money that's lost by the victims of fraud or the money laundering that subsequently happens. It's about the emotional, the psychological impacts on the people. And it's people like me, you, our family, our friends that are often the victims. It blights our economy, society, and the lives of often quite the most vulnerable. And like I say, together we can play a small part in making a real difference to fraud and money laundering. Now, thank you for staying with me. I appreciate I've talked to you quite a lot this morning. So hopefully that was interesting and beneficial for you. And we have got a little bit of time this morning for some question and answers.
Brilliant, perfect. So, Harriet, we do have a couple of questions if that's okay. So, the first question is, what checks are in place to detect fraudsters who have changed their name by deed poll?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's quite a relevant question to today's session as well. Now, to change your name, you do need an official document, as the question alludes to. Um, you need a document that provides evidence that you've changed your name, and that's a DPOL document quite often. That will enable you to get all your official documents and your records changed to your new name. An electronic search, like one via Thirdfort, will highlight any inconsistencies within the name given and subsequently the verification. So I like to think of it more holistically. So do an address check, proof of ownership, land registry filings, the date of the purchase. So I've mentioned this in today's session. So making sure we're alive to when was the purchase, the property purchased, what age would that make the person who's presenting themselves to you? Is there a date of birth alignment there, and the document issue and the expiry date? They're all things we can remain alive to, which may indicate that something's not quite right. But doing a strong, effective address matching check is probably one of the best ways to identify a problem with DPOL, or that somebody has changed their name. Providers like Thirdfort, they like to keep track of name changes to make sure that they keep accurate credit profiles. For example, if you think about other situations, if you think about like banks and people like that, they don't want people building up a bad credit score and then changing their name to get out of it. So quite often providers will keep quite a strong what would be the right word? A strong view of these kind of situations occurring. It's pretty effective from my experience, because like I say, for that reason alone, and there are many others, they want to stay quite close to that. It is easy to change your name by a DPOL to somebody else. We again, we have to acknowledge that. I think it's like an £18 fee to be able to do it online, but it's much harder to create a credit profile of you living at that address. Okay, so it's easy to change your name, but building that background information that would be highlighted within electronic checks is much harder. The key difference would be date of birth. You can change your name, but you can't change the year that you were born. And so if you try to do it, it would end up being two different people with the same name, but different details. So different date of birth, both living at the same address, but like I say, you'll have different date of birth. So data providers will be able to flag discrepancies like that will look suspicious and will alert you to needing to pay more attention. So making sure that date of birth always matches is key. Making sure you do that database address match is also key, and making sure you pay close attention to issue dates and expiries of ID documents as well. A recently issued ID document that could indicate a change. It could just be a genuine renewal. We have to acknowledge that it's not always a suspicion, but what it might be is just that pay a little bit closer attention to. It could be a red flag. So you may ask for a copy of the expired ID if that's what they say. If it was genuine, it expired, I got a new passport, you could ask for the expired one that gets sent back to you. You know, with corner cut off, we've all been in that situation where we've got it back through. That could be your enhanced measure. Alternatively, driving licenses, they're issued for 10 years. You can identify changes by reviewing the time, the date of issue, and the date of expiry. If those two dates are less than 10 years, that indicates a change to that driving license. And that could be a change of name, but it could, and more commonly what I see is that's a change of address. But again, by looking out for those little warnings, that could trigger us to ask the next question. That could lead us on to somewhere else. If there are any warnings on any electronic screening that you do on your client, as part of your client due diligence, you do need to ensure that they're followed up, that you pay attention to them with additional inquiries and potentially additional evidence on a risk-based approach to prove that the individual lives in the property, or in the case of a property seller, maybe you're thinking more proof of ownership. Ultimately, changing your name by default is definitely what I'd say a tried and tested way of getting around and trying to circumvent the policies, controls, and procedures that we have in our firms to commit fraud. But when we're using screening providers, they are constantly evolving as well, along with the criminals, and they're learning and trying to create more ways to mitigate that risk. And so just paying close attention to any warnings that you get on your electronic screening report can really put you one step ahead of the baddies.
Brilliant, perfect. Thank you, Harriet. And then the second question we've got is source of funds and how far we have to go in terms of documents and savings.
Yeah,
That's
this
quite
is
an
a question.
open-ended. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a question I get quite often. I think this is one of the most common questions I get asked in a webinar. I think it's $1 million question in a lot of ways. And whilst I would love to sit here and give you guys a really black and white answer, unfortunately, I'm not going to do that. So I'm caveating what I'm going to say before I've even said it. Because it is quite exactly what you said. It's an open-ended question, and it is very much specific to a client and the matter. So you need to go as far back as possible that makes a clear picture of how the client has accumulated the money for their transaction. So we're looking to build a clear picture. For some, that could be as little as 6 months, particularly if that shows like a big life event. Okay, maybe it was some inheritance or something like that. For others, it might need a little bit more. It could mean that you even need to look back years. It will all depend on the unique facts and information that you get from your client. This is like a matter by matter assessment, and it should be attached and linked to the risk level that you've identified in your client and your matter and risk assessment as well. And that's where your matter and risk assessment becomes so important, because that will be the foundation of the depth that you need to go to. We always need to remember what a source of funds check is actually for. A source of funds check is to answer the question, how did the client accumulate the funds for this transaction? Okay, and then you need to think about beyond that, where and who the funds have come from, and look at like why do they have the money that they have? So how have they accumulated that money? And identifying the source of funds is one of the most valuable checks that you can do when we're talking about money laundering. Money laundering only occurs when dirty money is moved, and so identifying the source of funds and how they accumulated them and where it came from is really fundamental in stopping and fighting money laundering. Now, again, another question, and this wasn't kind of in the top lead question, but I did recently get a question of how do I know that I'm done? How do I know that I've done enough? How do I get comfortable that I've done enough? Now, if your client's explanation is consistent with their risk profile, it's consistent with the type of transaction that you're being asked to undertake, if all the evidence that you've received aligns, it supports your understanding, the client's explanation makes sense, it all matches up, it raises no further questions, you don't have any other AML concerns about the transaction, the transaction is consistent, you don't suspect there's any existing criminal property involved at all, you don't need to go further to prove that the funds are clean. But the important part comes back to making sure you document the questions asked, the answers given, and any supporting material received. Should your transaction or the client relationship be questioned by your regulator or law enforcement at a later date, what you want to make sure you've got is that you've got your deck of cards ready, they're all in order, all your ducks are in a row, and you've documented that on the file accordingly, and saving the due diligence where it's easily accessible as well. So that would be my top tip, was making sure that you document it all really clearly.
Brilliant, perfect. I will just quickly check to see if we've had any more questions. Okay, so we haven't at the moment, Harriet. So what I'll do is thank you everyone so much for attending. I know how busy you are at the moment, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with us. If you would like to contact myself or Harriet, you can email us at Searches UK. Our email address is marketing@searchesuk.co.uk. Harriet has put her LinkedIn profile link in the slide presentation, so if you do want to contact Harriet, you can do that there. Again, you will get a copy of the recording after today's session, but thank you all so much for attending, and Harriet, thank you so much for hosting.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Take care everyone, and we'll speak to you all again soon. Bye.